Hello everyone, I hope all of you are doing well. Welcome to my next review video where I will be covering Square Enix's latest remake of a classic action JRPG game, Secret of Mana. Secret of Mana is part of Square Enix's Mana series and was originally released on the Super Nintendo in 1993 in Japan and North America, then in Europe in 1994. While it has been re-released on various platforms with some text and bug improvements, there hasn't been a remake of the game until recently. Before I get into the review, know that I have not played this game before, so the review will come from someone who is experiencing this game for the first time. I think this will be important as I have no nostalgic feelings for the game and come in without any personal attachment. When it comes to remakes, I'm always fearful of how much gets changed during the process. I'm actually a bit worried about how Final Fantasy VII is going to turn out, but that's a discussion for another video. The Secret of Mana remake did an amazing job of following the source material. All the bosses, environments, monsters, and characters were recreated in 3D with stunning accuracy. You could put the SNES version next to the remake and the scenes would be identical. The towns had all the buildings and NPCs in the same place, the levels and dungeons were made exactly the same even with monster placement, and the characters look like they're 2D sprites. While the graphics don't take advantage of today's current hardware, everything about the game still looks good. Yeah, it could be better, but I found what I saw acceptable. The dungeons and environments were designed beautifully and varied from scorching hot deserts to ice-cold winterlands. Square has incorporated cutscenes with facial expressions and body language to make scenes more lively instead of just having the standard plain text box that was present on the original game. Strangely, they decided to cheap out with the lip sync, causing scenes to look incomplete, cheap, and sometimes outright weird. Otherwise, it was amazing how well they translated the game from 2D sprites and textures to 3D. Square Enix also did a good job translating and remaking the classic soundtrack feel more updated. From what I've heard so far, the melodies sound exactly the same as the original. I also have to hand it to Square for giving players the option to use the classic soundtrack instead of the remade soundtrack. I know a lot of players who grew up with the game will appreciate and probably use this option over the remake. Personally, I used the remake since I did like the tracks and felt that the classic track didn't fit in with the updated look of the game. With that said, I'm actually disappointed Square didn't include a classic option to allow you to play with the 16-bit sprites for those who wanted that classic look. Odin Sphere included a classic game mode for their remaster, so I really don't see a reason why Secret of Mana could not for a remake. While this game has remained faithful to its SNES predecessor, it's a bit too faithful. Since it didn't change much, this means the remake also inherited everything that is outdated. This game did not age well, and as a result the gameplay mechanics suffered. Take for example the lack of information in the game, like a tutorial menu or item descriptions. Like most JRPGs back in the SNES days, they only gave you a brief explanation of mechanics or where to go during gameplay. There are no waypoints or detailed maps that we're used to having today, and switches or paths can be kind of hidden in plain view. Getting lost wasn't an issue for me though, since I do have a good sense of direction and good map memory, but it could be problematic for players who often rely on maps during their gameplay. On the bright side, they did add a game log which summarizes the last thing that happened, a useful resource not found in the original game. But if you want breadcrumbing guiding the way for you, you'll have to look elsewhere. One thing that did frustrate me was that I could not figure out how to interact with the mana crystals. It was mentioned that it was affected by magic, but it didn't occur to me that I could directly target it. Might have been obvious for most, but it eluded me for a bit. Character progression is very simple, as this is a faithful remake of an old game. During the course of gameplay, you will come across weapon orbs, which are obtained from beating bosses except for the last handful. Each orb is used to upgrade a weapon, which will give it a new passive but replace the old one, increase its attack, and increase its max mastery level. But to actually increase a character's weapon mastery level, he or she just has to use the weapon in combat. You'll also have to level up spells to make them more potent. Spells are leveled up in the same way weapon mastery is, by using it. I found this part of gameplay to be a little bit annoying, but it also works well. Since mana can be very limited during low levels, it forces you to either use ins if you're grinding, or makes you think about how you're going to use your spells and MP recovery during your level ups. Other than that, the only other progression mechanic is to buy new equipment and level up. Speaking of combat, let's see what combat is like. It contains some elements that are cool, but is mostly different than what I'm used to, and I have to say, I'm not a fan. The cool thing about Secret of Mana is the variety of weapons at your disposal, a good amount of spells, and the ability to switch between 3 characters if you're playing alone. The best part of this game is probably playing with your friends, something that not everyone will get to experience, myself included. On the bright side, the AI isn't too terrible for those of us who have to rely on them. The only problem that you'll run into is that sometimes the AI will get stuck or blocked by terrain, and they can't meet up with you. This is easily fixed by bringing up the ring menu when they get off screen, which will teleport them to you. You also get a few simple but effective AI behavior since combat isn't complicated. You can have them assist a character or attack a different enemy from everyone else. You can also control the level of charge attacks they use, but they'll always use that attack. But that's about all I liked about the combat. What ruins combat for me is the power gauge, which gets drained every time you attack and takes about 2 seconds to recharge. On top of that, this is also a resource that is slowly consumed as you run, and you can only initiate the run when you have a full bar. The power bar maxes out at 100% and the percentage will determine your attack power. This means it's best to attack when your gauge is full, which ends up slowing down the pace of combat. Luckily, there's more to combat than just spells and normal attacks. Players are able to charge their attack by holding down the attack button, which unleashes a new attack based on the charge level. To unlock a higher charge level, the weapon mastery level has to be increased. However, I found charge attacks to be very underwhelming due to the long charge times and my team's horrible hit rate. It was the worst feeling, charging up my attack, trying to dodge attacks with reduced speeds, only to miss when it was unleashed. Unless the enemy was unhittable, charging ended up being a waste of time. The other problem with combat was that hitboxes and hit confirms did not feel fluid. When an enemy was knocked onto the ground, you could attack them, but the attack wouldn't register immediately. Once they try to get up a second later, they would be knocked down again. Then there are times where it looks like an attack landed, but it won't register. This didn't happen too often, but when it did, it was very annoying since none of my physical attacks I used landed, even though it looked like they should have. Fighting bosses should have been the most exciting part of combat, but they were mostly stale with a few exceptions. The AI of the bosses felt very dated due to its very simple behavior and flow. All I did during boss fights was attack, move around while the gauge refills, then rinse and repeat until the boss dies. While some bosses have different skill sets such as flying or turning into balls of lightning, the fight still felt the same regardless of who I was fighting against. The worst was the last boss, which took forever to take down and it was not fun. You're only given about 20 seconds to damage a creature with Rondi, and about 30 seconds of downtime afterwards. With almost 1,000 health and 30 damage on regular attacks, critical hits, which are of course determined by RNG, is the main way to deal damage. So I just sat there for about 30 minutes, doing the same thing over and over again because I couldn't land any critical hits for the life of me. Some of the more interesting bosses have some gameplay elements that differentiated them from other bosses, so it changed up the fight. Wallface, while annoying, pushes you off the edge into spikes, which wipes the party. Due to the terrible accuracy of my party members, I had to figure out ways to defeat this boss before time ran out. And when I actually did, it felt great. Or take for example the tiger boss that jumps around a lot, forcing me to constantly be on the move and kept me on my toes. The worst thing about the game is the instability I experienced in my playthrough. Thank God for autosaves, or I would have lost hours of progress. I rarely have an issue with crashing in other games since I have a very standard playstyle, so I highly doubt it's only me. The story of the game is mediocre, but acceptable since it's unchanged from the Secret of Mana story, which was cut down when the game was being developed due to the cartridge limits and the SNES CD project falling through with Sony. The story is very linear, simple, and easy to follow. A boy finds a special sword and saves the world from destruction. That's literally it. There is a slight twist in the story, but nothing shocking. The main three characters were very likable, though I felt not enough time was used to develop them as deeply as I would have liked. Interestingly enough, I feel like I got a decent feel for their personality from the skits while resting at the end, which is another piece of content not in the original game. On the other hand, the antagonists were shallow and flat. Their motivations were briefly mentioned, but very little was explored. There were no moments of being hit in the feels or any moments of anger when something didn't go my way. I felt pretty neutral the whole way through. It would have been nice to see more time spent adding additional story elements like the multiple endings that were originally intended for the game. However, I was pleasantly surprised at the amount of voice acting. Every NPC is voiced, which is not something I've seen in a very long time. The inclusion of voice acting helps enhance the storytelling by bringing characters to life and gives player a deeper understanding of their personalities. I listened to the Japanese voices because I'm a weeb, no shame, and I really liked it. My favorite is Popoi and his very informal mannerisms. From the little Japanese that I do know, the English dialogue text did exclude some voice content. But I didn't catch much of it, so it didn't affect me. I can't say anything about the English voice actors because it's not something I use when given the option to choose Japanese voices. So with all things considered, while Square Enix definitely added a good amount of quality of life changes, I don't think there was enough to call it a success. I didn't enjoy the game as much as I would have liked to. While I respect their effort for remaining as faithful as possible to the original, there should have been improvement on the combat with the removal of the power gauge, or at the very least a reworking so I don't have to wait as long between attacks, and did a little more than add end scenes for character development. Even having more save slots would have been nice. I get it, you want the classic feel, but you gave me 2 save slots. Really, Square? You couldn't give me more than that? The game is incredibly short for the price as well. Since I beat the game over the weekend it came out, my total playtime came to be around 18 hours. This is just beating the game and not doing a 100% playthrough, which will add more time. But at that point it's just grinding, so I don't think that's really a valid point. I think this is a game that is perfect for people who enjoyed the Super Nintendo version of Secret of Mana and are looking for more updated graphics. The game looks good, although it's nothing to brag to your friends about, and is incredibly faithful to the original in all aspects. But for those who haven't played the original, I think it would be best to just buy and play the original. Then maybe the gameplay issues would be more acceptable since the technical limitations are made very clear at that point. And you'll probably not crash all the time either. That does it for my review. Let me know what you think of Secret of Mana, whether it's the Super Nintendo version or the remake. I would love to hear your thoughts. As always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.